And oh yeah, just one last thing before we begin. Next week, I've got a slight change in timetable. You know that these practices have been going on Tuesdays and Thursdays for the past year. Just for next week, it's going to be Wednesday and Friday. So for those of you who are coming in from Jamyang won't be able to advertise the Wednesday session, but you'll be able to access it through the website, my website, mindfulness.zone. But Fridays will be on Jamyang's website. Wonderful. Let us gently make our way in. So just spend a few moments just adjusting your posture, reminding yourself that you don't need to be anywhere else. And you'll notice this with the mind because of how much you've been moving around this morning, even over the past few minutes, getting your cushions and your seats ready. And all of those things that we have to do in our timetables for later on. I'll ring the bell so that we can release the past and the future. Using the bell as a call that will bring us into presence here in this moment we are starting to get to know of as the now, present moment. Feeling the seat underneath you. Feeling the way in which the tail end, the bottom end of your spinal column, how it rests on your pelvic bone, how those areas underneath the pelvic bone, the skin, the surfaces, they're resting on the cushions or the chairs underneath you. It's almost as though you were an aeroplane touching down on a runway. And so you've touched down, but you're still moving. And that's completely normal, even though we might remind ourselves it's not the body that's moving, but it's the mind. And this whole practice is that whole journey where the plane takes between that point at which it touches down and it finally reaches a full and complete stop. Where during this practice, you may already have started to get glimpses into this. You will find alignment between mind, body, and that which we refer to as the larger part of us, which really has no name because it cannot be contained within any sound or name, but because we live in this three-dimensional world, We use labels that many teachers have attempted to describe it as presence, awareness, consciousness. And this practice is about aligning these three parts. And to simplify this, we know for a fact that one part is almost certainly here, present in this moment, and that is the body. Your body is in this moment we we so often refer to as the present moment. And so we will be using the body as our doorway into the present moment. But the difference between this practice and our usual day-to-day movings and sayings and workings is that usually when we are operating, when we are living our lives, we are processing a huge amount of information through our five senses, of course. Things are entering in through our sense of sight. There are sounds entering into our sense of hearing. And then sometimes there are smells, sometimes there are tastes, and of course, there are almost always physical sensations. And so at any one moment, we are processing vast amounts of information, and each one of these sensations, these sensory experiences, they very often trigger off thoughts, memories, emotions. And soon we find ourselves drifting into that area called thinking and thoughts. And in this practice, I invite you to close your eyes, even if you're not comfortable for too long, just for a short while, so that you can limit this information that is entering into your experience. The phones are switched off. The conversations are somewhat minimized. Smells and tastes, they may still be there, but there's nothing new coming in. And that's what makes this practice a little bit easier. Simply because we're going to direct our focus, direct our attention to one thing at a time. And maybe one thing, using the terminology, the word one thing may not be that accurate. One sense, one of the senses at any given time. And you can start with the eyes. Where the eyelids, for most of us, they're closed. And if you want to open your eyes, you're more than welcome to as well, because that can also be a very useful practice. But if your eyes are closed, notice how awake and alert you are. And notice how This is pointing towards this practice where, despite the eyes being closed, you are more awake, more alert, more conscious of all of the sensations that are arriving into your experience. But as you focus on your eyes, if your eyelids are closed, you'll still see the dance of shadows, the light entering in through your experience through the eyelids. And if your eyelids are open, if your eyes are open, just looking, releasing the need to define, to give meaning. Excuse the doorbell. I've actually put a note on my door. They should leave it on the doorstep. But that's practice. Different sensations. And with the sound, bringing your attention to your ears. And in my background, you might have heard a doorbell in your... What can you hear in your background? When smells and tastes and sensory experiences enter into your experience, release them and just direct yourself to this one sense, the sense of hearing. And usually you'll notice when it comes to the sense of hearing, you'll notice how the first sounds, very often the first sounds you will notice are those that are disturbing or distracting your practice. The doorbells, the voices, the sirens, the roadworks. And this becomes a very useful part of the practice because it somewhat shows you how likes and dislikes stimulate the mind. Because most of the sounds we normally notice are either those sounds that we like or dislike. And it is these sounds that stimulate thought, that result in new thought forms, new thought waves arising. And you've likes and dislikes. Another word for likes and dislikes would simply be judgments. What can you hear around you in addition to my voice and the sound of this bell? Now shift your focus from these so-called distracting sounds or sounds that you like to other sounds around you that you barely noticed. For me, I'll give you examples of what sounds. I noticed the ringing of my doorbell. I noticed the knocking on my door. So those kind of stimulated thought. I had thoughts. Should I get up? Should I leave this practice? Should I answer the door? So you see, that's how it stimulated my thought. because I entered into this practice having written notes on my door and not really expecting to be disturbed. So that stimulated thought. And in the same way, in your private space, you set aside this hour to practice something called mindfulness meditation, and then you might have had a slightly similar expectation that there be silence, that there be quiet. But then there may be some sounds that you have little control over, and those stimulate your thoughts. And then there are those sounds in my surroundings which I didn't notice, like the sound of my computer's fan. My computer's fan humming in the background, which doesn't bother me at all. It's become a part of this practice because I use this particular laptop in front of me. And then in the background, I have a school about 100 meters away. So there are children playing in the playground. There's laughter. There's those usual sounds that kids make when they're having fun. And that's in the background. I completely allow it. I have no problem or no issues with it because I've become so accustomed to these sounds over the past 1.5 years. And that simply means I have very little judgment about it. What about you? Are there any sounds around you which are just neutral, that you neither like nor dislike? My reason for spending this much time on this particular aspect of the practice is because it is these neutral sounds that can be very useful tools in your practice. When you're seated in your room, when you're cooking, whatever you're doing, anywhere you are, whether you're at the post office, whether you're on the streets, in the park, awakening your sense of hearing, and then listening out for these sounds that you don't normally notice. They might be very faint, or they might be quite loud, but just simply irrelevant to you. But fixing your focus on these neutral sounds will have the effect of slowing the thought process down. And then you might think about something else, your meetings. You might think about something that's going on in your relationship, and the practice is simply guiding your focus and your attention back to this particular neutral sound that you neither like nor dislike. And simply watch as the mind begins to slow down. Where is your mind right now? We're all so different. Each one of us carrying a mind that is moving at a completely different speed. Some of us may be sitting here saying, I can't meditate. This is really difficult. My thoughts keep taking me away into that thing, that incident, that conversation that happened a few moments ago, a few days ago, many years ago, right? Maybe jumping and fast forwarding into the future with its anticipation, its expectation. If you can, let's try to understand this momentum a little bit better. And this will make sense in a short while because it will help us to understand this practice that we are embarking on. If you can imagine a car on top of a slope, so it's handbrake. I don't know if you drive or not, but the handbrake is what keeps the car from moving. Now, if the handbrake were released and you gave, and the car started moving down the slope, try to visualize it. Initially, notice how slowly the car moves. The tires might be moving maybe almost centimeters or inches because the speed is very slow at the top where it's just starting to move. And then notice how it begins to gather momentum as it makes its way down the slope. And it gets faster and faster and faster until it becomes pretty fast, too fast to actually stop if you were outside of the car. Let's pretend there's no one in the car. Now, if this car were to represent your mind, at what stage of this slope have you found it? Is it moving very fast? Are you still feeling quite agitated and uncomfortable and waiting for something to happen? Or is it way up the slope where it's quite still? It might even have completely stopped. It may be right at the top of the slope before it started moving. Or it might be somewhere in between where it's just moving at a relatively slow momentum. Now, my point in going about in this roundabout way is simply that this practice is where we learn how to make our way up the slope. Because at the top of the slope, all you need is a single finger. You can stop the car with a single finger before the momentum even began. And this is a practice where you will learn how to get to know yourself a lot better. You will begin recognizing those events and circumstances around you that trigger this moment, a particular momentum. And so right now, let's consider ourselves beginners. And so the mind that we find is one that is moving quite quickly, maybe halfway, maybe 3/4 way down the slope. So we do not attempt to stop the mind. We simply step aside. Notice the speed, notice the momentum, recognize where it's coming from. Schools, things that parents have said, the advertising industry, how much television we've watched, like the news and all of those programs that have really stimulated the mind. And that's exactly where you will find the mind at this moment. And our practice involves tapping into the present moment. And since we are beginners, it will begin simply with tiny little glimpses of the present moment, and then we'll get caught up in the momentum. And then glimpses again, and then momentum. And so we get caught up in the stories around us. But as we practice, we will automatically find ourselves being transported higher and higher up the slope, so that we begin discovering the mind and its momentum at a much slower pace. It becomes easier to redirect, to sometimes simply stop that momentum, that flow. And sometimes we'll find ourselves completely at the top, almost expecting, almost anticipating exactly what that person in our life that is that little irritant, shall we say. We almost know that's what's going to be said. And we know how that's going to trigger off the momentum. And so we are able, with just a little finger, to stop the momentum. And that's why we call it a practice. We will gradually make our way up there together as a group. And in our own practice. And this is a good moment to remind ourselves what our own practice involves. It doesn't necessarily involve sitting in this way and focusing on just one sensation at a time, or one thing at a time. It simply involves being present in every moment and noticing when the mind has taken us away from that moment. Bringing ourselves back through our five senses into that particular moment. The eyes seeing what is in front of the body, the ears listening to the symphony of sounds that surround us, the nose and the tongue telling us about the smells and the tastes before us, and the sensations that surround us through our skin, from the fabric of our clothing, from the fabric that you can feel right now through the surfaces of your skin, to the temperature in this room around you that is so different from what we experienced last week, at least for those of us within the UK. Present. And using the mind. Have you noticed we have been using the mind since we began this practice? You've been using the mind to translate the sounds that I'm making through my lips. It's through your mind that you learned this language that I'm using called English. Let's have a little, let's have a few more glimpses into how we're using the mind. Feel the texture of the clothing that's covering your body. Because in this present moment, your body is covered in some form of fabric, some form of clothing. And so you are using your mind to translate this present moment. One aspect of this present moment, because there is a lot happening in this present moment. But notice, we call this a practice. And because we called it a practice, we'll focus on just one thing at a time, so that later on we'll be a little bit better when we are translating all five senses, all the input that's arriving through five senses. Right now, it's just the skin. Notice, doesn't matter whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable, but just feel the fabric. Does it feel tight, loose? Notice the word tight, loose. That's something that comes from the mind. And we all have we all do give different meanings to these words, depending on our own likes and dislikes, and just because of how unique and interesting we all are. Notice your ability to experience the folds, the bends, the way in which the fabric bends around some areas of your body, how it falls. You might even get glimpses into the layer of warm air that's trapped underneath the fabric, which becomes so much more vivid when you contrast it against those parts of your body that are exposed, that are in direct contact with the air and the space around you. Now direct your mind to the nostrils. Mind, I would like you to inch your way towards the nostrils so that I may experience this process called breathing. And notice how, as you begin focusing on the sensations of your breath, Because after all, the breath, it cannot be seen. It can only be experienced through the skin as a temperature, as a direction, an indicator as to whether you are taking an in breath or an out breath. As humidity, as warmth, as coolness. And you notice how your sense of touch, it extends within the nasal passage. You can feel the moistness within that area. You direct your mind once again to the throat. Notice how we're not going to spend too long at a particular part because the mind, we're beginning to understand how the mind quite easily gets bored. And so every time we detect that it's beginning to get bored with one particular area, we move to another. And in the throat, within the throat, you can feel the movement of air flowing down and up the windpipe. And each one of us, again, we're so unique that as we develop our own practices, some of us may be able to stay with a particular area for long durations. And some of us, we might prefer to refocus at short intervals, like the chest. Feel the breathing process within your chest, how your chest translates these various sensations of the chest wall rising and then falling. And what makes the chest wall rise and fall? It's the lungs within that seem to magically push against the rib cage. The rib cage pushing against the muscle pushing against the nerves, and then finally the skin. And through the skin, the fabric of clothing that covers that particular area. We're also beginning to get glimpses into some of the more interesting qualities of the mind. How the mind has the ability to focus on only one thing at a time. And that usually means when we take an interest on this process called breathing, or as we did a few moments ago of those neutral sounds, the mind, it leaves most of its stories behind. In fact, you could say that it leaves all of the stories. It leaves the finances, it leaves the conversations and those meetings that you have lined up later on. And it joins you more completely, more fully in this present moment. And it begins to dawn on you that every future moment will arrive as a present moment. and in the exact way in which you are translating the present moment. When that moment arrives, in presence, in this stillness, within this stillness, you will know exactly what to say, what to do, what to be. And so we release that future which we can do very little about except in this present moment. And perhaps at this present moment, we are doing the most that we could possibly do in training the mind to be here in this present moment, which is the only moment that is relevant to us as we train the mind, as we sit, as we breathe, as we practice. But it's because we're beginners. At least that's the way we're all seeing ourselves to be in this practice today. We will notice how the mind, it jumps back into those stories. And then maybe with the bell, the ringing of the bell, which is a call to awareness, we return. Sometimes the glimpses of the present moment, that's all they are, glimpses that become gaps, that become a little bit more space and a little bit more space until we find ourselves grounding ourselves more consistently in this moment, spending more moments here in the only moment that ever existed, and more aware than ever before when the mind drifts away. Whereby through practice, it becomes even more apparent when we have drifted away in thought, and therefore so much easier to bring ourselves back. Recognizing the 5 doorways that we have into the present moment. We've explored our eyes, we've explored our ears, we've explored our skin, the sense of smell and the sense of taste. Save that for your meal. Or those moments in the shower where you have those fragrant perfumes and soaps, the mint within toothpaste. All these doorways, ever present, ever accessible. Now I'm going to ring the bell. An opportunity to stretch, to move, to have a sip of water. And if you think you've had enough of a practice, then to simply take a break and tune out. But here comes the bell. If you do decide to move your body or to change your posture, home in on the sensations as to how relief feels like. That relief that comes with completely letting go. Notice how easy it is to find ease in this present moment. And a moment ago, we spoke as we were examining the ways in which to practice listening meditation, where we listen to neutral sounds, sounds that do not stimulate. We're going to move into a visualization now. And in this visualization, we'll revisit a practice that we often use, that of the tree. And you can envision your favorite woods or maybe a tree in your garden. You might have a favorite tree or just a random tree you've seen in a picture. But we want it to be quite a stable tree, one that's been here for a very long time, just like we have. And I'm not referring just to our physical form, a very long time. At least that's what the teachers say when they speak about our awareness, our state of consciousness, our presence. They say it exists within a space that is timeless. And that's a very long time. And as we speak of trees, as we visualize trees, you'll notice that many teachers, even teachers like Eckhart Tolle, they often describe nature as one of the most wonderful doorways into the present moment. Simply because there, very often when we're in nature, we find ourselves free of concepts, of labels. We seem to be so much more accepting of nature. The paint or the colors don't have to be a certain way. The architecture doesn't have to be a certain way. The nature is just nature. And so, once again, we're utilizing our mind. We're directing our mind to move through its library of images and bring out one of those trees that it has seen in a postcard in real life. Now give this tree a three-dimensional feel. And one easy way in which we can do this is by merging our bodies into this image. And so the trunk of this tree becoming the trunk of your body, and vice versa, your body becoming the trunk of this great tree. And your arms, they can be like the branches, at least two of the main branches of this tree. And then there is a further branch where your face is, where your ears are, where your head is, where your nose is. And have you noticed throughout this practice, we've been talking about something called the present moment? Just imagine, use your mind once again to imagine what it would be like to be anchored completely in the present moment. Your past would dissolve. Your future would dissolve. You would find yourself in a space where there are no standards, where you can no longer be too thin, you can no longer be too tall or too short. You can no longer consider yourself as too fair or too dark or too tanned or whatever it is those standards are that the mind has created through time. And so, with the ringing of this bell, all that you find right now in this present moment is perfection. Just as the tree, feel the way in which the tree does not compare itself to any of the other trees in these woods or in this garden. It just accepts its uniqueness, its beauty. And I think it's Eckhart Tolle who often speaks about how trees are deeply present because it's quite obvious they don't have minds like we do. But yet, they experience themselves through those other aspects of nature that are also present. And so there are birds, there are squirrels, all forms of life, including the human beings that seem to walk underneath these branches of ours because of how large and majestic we are. And this tree, it experiences itself only through these aspects of presence, through the eyes of the squirrel, through the eyes of the birds that have built their nests on its branches, through the eyes of the migratory birds that stop to feed themselves, to nourish themselves, to rest. Through the eyes of the human beings underneath who pass through, who see this beauty, who see the leaves as they change their colors, who see the flowers or the fruit in appreciation. Appreciation that is simply possible only through presence in this moment. Let's ground ourselves because in this practice we can see the breeze blowing through our branches. We can see approaching clouds. We can see rain and sometimes storms that are all moving, that are all changing, just like the changing seasons. Does that sound familiar? The mind, with its different emotions, which, or rather, the mind, which is brings about different emotions through its interpretations of the present moment. And very often, we get so caught up in these stories, these comparisons, these standards that I need to be as rich or as famous or like that other person or those persons around me. And we find ourselves mistakenly identifying with the clouds, with the wind, with the storms, with the rain, with the snow. And then it gets very chaotic. And so, with the ringing of this bell, find your roots. Move down to the lower parts of your body and then visualize your center of gravity merging into the ground underneath you. These roots, they're already here, but you're just becoming aware of them right now. These roots that ground you into the present moment. Feel all of those surfaces underneath of your body that are supported by the cushions and the chairs and the mats. These surfaces underneath you dissolving and merging, your body merging into the flooring, these seats, these surfaces underneath you, so that you find yourself anchoring, more stable, more still, so that you may now glance upon these standards, these movements, this momentum. The momentum may be strong, the movement may be fast, but watch how your branches, they sway and they dance to this movement. The breeze and the storms brushing against these branches. And I use the word dance simply because this is a dance. We do not attempt to change the world around us, at least not this particular moment, not when we are caught up in stories. We stabilize ourselves first. And feel your body swaying to these winds, allowing, releasing, letting go, giving up the need to hold on to the snowflakes or the raindrops or even the wind, simply allowing them to flow past. And then notice those branches that are less allowing, those that are quite rigid and tight, those prejudices, those beliefs that we know no longer serve us. With the ringing of this bell, allow the wind to take these branches, allow cracks to appear, allow these branches to simply fall away. Stretching the top end of your spinal column upward, simply because you feel a little bit lighter now. The ability to gain much height due to this lightness. Grounded, stable, sitting, breathing. Soon you will be walking, you will be eating, you will be shopping, you will be cooking, you will be working. But we will bring this presence and awareness with us. Having reminded ourselves of our ability to focus. And here comes the final bell, which we will use to symbolize the beginning of our practice. Our own personal practice, which we will consider to be an art. An art because each and every one of us will find a different set of circumstances around us. And we will dance with these circumstances. We will dance with these voices. We will dance with the people and all else, the sounds and the sights and the smells and the tastes. Yet grounded, present, and aware. big thank you to all of you for joining in today's practice.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. Take care, my dear friends.
Bye.
Bye bye. Bye bye. Lovely seeing all of you.